The book of Obadiah is the shortest book in the entire Old Testament. There are only 21 verses in this singular chapter. The book of Obadiah chronicles or records the descendants of one brother who rose up to destroy the descendants of another brother. The first brother's name was Esau. The second brother's name was Jacob. They were biological brothers. And over time, they both grew into great nations. And the descendants of one brother, Esau, rose up to help destroy the descendants of the other brother, Jacob. If you want to learn more about this, in Jeremiah chapter 49, verse 7 through verse 12, the prophet Jeremiah echoes the words of the prophet Obadiah. The ungodly descendants of Esau rose up to help destroy the godly descendants of Jacob. All of this occurred somewhere around 606 to 536 BC. I'll talk more about that time period in a moment. This struggle that Obadiah records teaches us three valuable lessons about how dangerous it is to play with God. Obadiah gives us all three of those lessons in these 21 verses that make up the book that bears his name. Here is the first lesson that Obadiah teaches in these 21 verses. It is found in verse 10 down through verse 14. The first lesson he teaches is this: never kick a man when he's down. Now, sadly, in our society, and this disturbs me, and I pray that none of you have ever been a part of it. I pray that none of you will ever be a part of it. And that is, sometimes you watch videos on YouTube. There used to be a very popular internet service or streaming service called World Star. And what World Star was known for was capturing fights on video. You've also seen it on YouTube. Unfortunately, it has happened in our own community where fights have occurred, large fights, and the fight is captured on video. I want to breathe a word to you, a side word, that if ever you see somebody getting jumped on, the last thing you need to do is take out and hold up a camera and watch them getting jumped on. And let me share something with you for free. If somebody is jumping on me and you take out a camera and watch them jumping on me, I can't wait till I see your footage. Because I know I'm going to be able to hear your name behind that camera, and I'm coming to find them, and I'm coming to find you. So I can pray for you both. The Bible talks about all different forms of prayer, and I'm coming to pray on. I pray for both of y'all after you have watched me getting jumped on. God says to the people of Edom, through the prophet Obadiah, never kick a man when he's down. The history of the descendants of Esau and the descendants of Jacob. By the time we get to the book of Obadiah, God had gotten upset with the godly line of Jacob. As a result, God decided to punish them. They had been disobedient. They were worshiping idol gods. God had done so much for them, and he became tired of their disobedience. God's frustration had reached a fever pitch, and God decided that he was going to allow judgment to fall on his own people, his own godly people. That means sometimes, even though you love God, when you get out of line, God has got to pull you back in line. A parent who really loves their children won't allow that child to continue to stray away without pulling that child back in. The method that God used in 606 BC to pull his people back in line, he allowed them to be taken captive by a rogue, ungodly nation called the Babylonians. In Jeremiah chapter 29, you discover that God was going to allow this oppression to occur for 70 years, from 606 BC all the way down to 536 BC. Because you may remember that when we count time BC, or before Christ, it counts down instead of counting up. God was going to allow them to be held captive for 70 years. That means God says, Babylonians, take over my people, deport them from their homeland, take them to the distant land of Babylon. And the Babylonians did exactly what God allowed them to do. The problem occurred when people who were connected to God decided to join in with the Babylonians and help them to jump on their own kinsmen. In other words, when their brother Jacob was down, Esau kicked his own brother through their descendants, and God was displeased. Obadiah writes about it in verse 10 down through verse 14. Here's what he says beginning in verse 10. He says, because of the murderous history compiled against your brother Jacob, you will be looked down on by everyone. You'll lose your place in history. On that day you stood there and didn't do anything. Strangers took your brother's army into exile. Godless foreigners invaded and pillaged Jerusalem. You stood there and watched. You were as bad as they were. You shouldn't have gloated over your brother when he was down and out. You shouldn't have laughed and joked at Judah's sons when they were face down in the mud. You shouldn't have talked so big when everything went so bad. You shouldn't have taken advantage of my people when their lives had fallen apart. You of all people should not have been amused by their troubles, their wrecked nation. You shouldn't have taken the shirt off their back when they were knocked flat, defenseless. And you shouldn't have stood waiting at the outskirts and cut off refugees and traitorously turned in helpless survivors who had lost everything. God says, I'm sick of you because you kicked a man when he was down. And I want to warn you, some of you say, Pastor Thorpe, I don't intend on getting in any street fights anytime soon, but fights break out on your job, fights break out in your neighborhood, fights break out in your school. Not all of these fights are physical fights. Sometimes they are character assassinations, where someone in your department starts slandering someone else in the department, and you either join in or stand by and watch it without saying anything in defense. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said some decades ago that he would not only be disturbed by the actions of his enemies, but he would be disturbed by the silence of his friends. It's not just what you do to people. Sometimes it's what you stand by and allow to happen to people. God says that his problem with Edom, or the Edomites, began when they kicked their own brother when he was down. So the first lesson that this text is tailored to teach: never kick a man when he's down. There's a second lesson in this text that Obadiah teaches. It is found in verse 1 through verse 10, then in verse 15 through verse 16. It is this: never get so high until you forget you can be thrown down. Doesn't matter how much you think you have, how big you think you are. The old saints will say it like this: no matter how high I get, I'll still be looking up to you. And sometimes, not only y'all in here, but you got some cousins in Wyoming who have this problem. That they get so big, they get so much, until they assume that they made it all by themselves and no one can bring them down. The Edomites had not only been blessed numerically and militarily, they had also been blessed geographically. They lived in the mountains. And because of this key geographical location, they were constantly looking down on people, not just figuratively, but literally. They felt that because of the high perch that they occupied, it made them superior to all those who were around them. But God sent word to them that it doesn't matter how high you get, I can still bring you down. The New Testament warns us that if you bring yourself down, God will raise you up. But if you raise yourself up, God has the power to bring you down. Which means it doesn't matter what you got going for you. Recognize that it came to you from God, and He can pull it away whenever He gets ready. I try to walk in a position constantly. Some years ago, one of the young men of our church, Brother Shannon Showers, was graduating from high school and going off to college. And as he was accepting his scholarship and he gave his acceptance speech, he started thanking people in his life who had meant a lot to him. He thanked all the folks that we would have assumed that he would thank, and that was his parents, his friends, his teachers, his coaches, his educators. But then he said, I want to thank the janitors who walk through the halls of this school on a regular basis and keep things nice and safe for us. I want to thank the folks who work in the cafeteria, who prepare our meals and see to it that we are nourished throughout the school day. What he was saying was, it doesn't matter what scholarship I'm signing. I wouldn't be where I am today were it not for all the people around me, regardless of the position that they serve in. And sometimes if we're not careful, we can get a little high and walk by people and won't even speak. Because we have a name tag on our desk and they have a name tag stitched on their uniform. And somehow you assume that one name tag means more than the other. Till you break down on the side of the road and need somebody to give you a ride. Till you find yourself in a place of crisis and you need someone to help pull you out. You've got to be careful how you treat people when you're up so that God doesn't bring you down. Some years ago, I was attending a banquet and the lady sitting across the table from me was a health care provider. She was a registered nurse. And she said, Pastor Thorpe, I guess she was looking for somebody to confess to. And she said, Pastor Thorpe, I need to make a confession. She said, recently I was diagnosed with cancer. I had been receiving chemotherapy treatments. And she said, I want to be honest with you, that when I was only a healthcare provider, I was not nice enough to the people that I served. She said, but now the tables are turned. And now I am the healthcare recipient and I am looking for grace and mercy from healthcare providers. Don't ever get so high until you forget that the Lord can bring you down. Never get so high not until you forget you can be thrown down. That's what you find in verse 1 through verse 10 and in verse 15 through verse 16. Obadiah's message to Edom from God, the master, verse 1 says, we got the news straight from God by a special messenger sent out to the godless nations. On your feet, prepare for battle. Get ready to make war on Edom. Listen to this, Edom. I'm turning you to a no account. The runt of the godless nations despised. You thought you were so great. Perched high among the rocks, king of the mountain, thinking to yourself, nobody can get to me. Nobody can touch me. Think again. Even if, like an eagle, you hang out on a high cliff face, even if you build your nest in the stars, I'll bring you down to the earth, God's sure word. If thieves crept up on you, they'd rob you blind. Isn't that so? If they mugged you on the streets at night, they'd pick you clean. Isn't that so? Or they'll take Esau apart piece by piece, empty his purse and his pockets. All your old partners will drive you to the edge. Your old friends will lie to your face. Your old drinking buddies will stab you in the back. Your world will collapse. You won't know what hit you, so don't be surprised. It's God's sure word. When I wipe out all sages from Edom, and rid the Esau mountains of its famous wise men. Your great heroes will desert you, Teman. That was their capital city. There'll be nobody left in Esau's mountain because of the murderous history compiled against your brother Jacob. You will be looked down on by everyone. You'll lose your place in history. God says you thought you were high, but I'm about to bring you down. May I ask you a rather sobering question that I try to ask myself often? What if you woke up tomorrow with only the things you thanked God for today? Let me see if I can say that again. What if you woke up tomorrow with only the things that you thanked God for today? Nearly a year ago, I was diagnosed with diabetes. It is what they call type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is when your pancreas does not produce insulin. Type 2 diabetes is when your pancreas does not produce sufficient insulin, and insulin is used to regulate your blood sugar internally. And one of the things they asked me was, how often do you see a podiatrist, a foot doctor? I said, I don't have to see a foot doctor. They said, you're not dealing with any wounds that need to be cared for in your lower extremities? I said, no, ma'am, I don't have any wounds in my lower extremities. And she said, be careful, because if your condition persists, it can create things like chronic neuropathy, where you lose feeling and sensation in your extremities. Sores can form. Those sores will be difficult to heal, and you can end up in a state of amputation. You know what I started doing? Thanking God for my feet. You don't hear what I'm saying. What are you thankful for? Or what is it in your life that you have been taking for granted? Parents say, turn the TV off. Be thankful you can turn it off. Amen. My friend of the ages, Reverend Dr. Tom Diamond, went home to be with the Lord some years ago. His son, Eugene, took over the pastorate after him. Dr. Diamond was preaching one night, and he said that one of his members came into his office, and she was just praising God uncontrollably. And he said, "Daughter, why are you giving God so much praise?" And she responded, "Pastor, they turned my lights off." And she kept on praising. He said, "Now, excuse me. You say the reason you're praising God is because the Jacksonville Electric Authority turned your power off?" She said, "Pastor, the real reason I'm praising God is that when I flipped the switch, I still had sense enough to know the lights didn't come on." You didn't hear what I said. She had moved beyond being thankful for the house, moved beyond the fact that she had had lights, because the fact that you have had lights means you can have lights. That means if the Lord doesn't take me higher, if he just brings me back to where I already was. Her thanksgiving was over the fact that when she flipped the switch, she was still in her right mind and recognized that the lights did not come on. What if you woke up tomorrow with only the things you thank God for today? That means you just lay in your bed and look at everything around you, wherever you are, and thank God for everything you see. Don't forget to thank him for the bed. And when you thank God for the things that he has done and the things that he is doing, you need to also thank him for the stuff that could have happened that didn't happen. Thank him for the phone call you didn't get. Because one phone call, been there, can turn your whole world upside down. God says to them in verse 10 through verse 14, never kick a man when he's down. In verse 1 through verse 10 and in verse 15 through verse 16, God says to them, never get so high until you forget you can be thrown down. But here's the last thing I want to leave you with. It's in verse 17 through verse 21. It is this: even when you are down, God can raise you up. Now remember, all of this is occurring because God's people, Jacob, had been disobedient to him. God's frustration had reached a fever pitch. He allowed them to be taken captive by the Babylonians. That captivity was to last for 70 years, from 606 BC to 536 BC. But God spoke to the prophet Daniel and said to Daniel that when I bring my people into trouble, when they learn their lesson, I will bring them out of trouble. The reason God has to address the Edomites is because when their brother was in trouble, they kicked them. But what they didn't realize was God would pull them down and take his people and raise them back up. You know what that leads me to say to you? Be careful of looking at people in the chapter 1 of their life, because the story is not over. And just because they are down in chapter 1, if you keep reading to somewhere around chapter 5, the same people who are down, God has a way of taking the last and making them first. That's why you got to be careful how you treat people. They're not going to always be where they are. And if they are trusting God, God has the power to raise you up even after he has taken you down. Watch what you find beginning in verse 17. He says, but not so on Mount Zion. There's respite or rest there, a safe and holy place. The family of Jacob will take back their possessions from those who took them from them. That's when the family of Jacob will catch fire. The family of Joseph will become fierce flame, while the family of Esau will be strong. Esau will go up in flames. Nothing left of Esau but a pile of ashes. God said it, and it is so. People from the south will take over the Esau mountains. People from the foothills will overrun the Philistines. They'll take the farms of Ephraim and Samaria, and Benjamin will take Gilead. Earlier, Israelite exiles will come back and take Canaanite land to the north at Zerubbabel. Jerusalem exiles from the far northwest to Sepharad will come back and take the cities in the south. The remnant of the saved in Mount Zion will go into the mountains of Esau and rule justly and fairly, a rule that honors God's kingdom. That means I'm down, but God has the power to raise me up. That means don't look down on me when you see me fall. Don't get in the fight on the side of my enemies. God says when you see a man down, you ought to be able to do something to help him. The old school quartet singers would say, don't look down on a man unless you're looking down to pick him up. They also said, sweep around your own front door before you try to sweep around mine. Which means you got to be careful about how you cast judgment on people when they are struggling. You don't know what they're going through. You don't know what they went through. Because some of us are mess. Not none of y'all in here, but some of y'all cousins in Mississippi, they something else. And we pick on people when they fall, as if we have never fallen. When the truth is, some of us have fallen, the Lord just covered the fall. And the only difference between your fall and my fall is one fall was covered and the other fall was uncovered. Never get to the place that you begin to think that God cannot bring you down when you get too high. What are you saying, Pastor Thorpe? God says, don't play with me. I see all, I know all, I can do all. And all the people said, amen. Amen. Standing all over this place.